I mean, the aim of the book is to accelerate action, and we're coming from this from different mentalities, maybe have different frameworks for. I mean, I think a core part of human psychology is that like audiences respond differently to different messages, and part of my thesis is that often people respond positively to seeing momentum, right? The worst position you can be in is feeling like you've been trying for decades and decades and making no progress whatsoever. Then you kind of reach this fatigue where you say, oh, like, I feel like there's actually just nothing we can do now.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is data scientist and head of research at the online publication Our World in Data, Hannah Ritchie. Ritchie's new book, Not the End of the World: How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet, is described as bold and radically hopeful. Mongabay obtained an advance copy from the publisher in preparation for this interview. Ritchie says her book is a how-to for addressing the urgent, massive environmental problems the world faces. But our co-host Rachel Donald and myself found ourselves with some unanswered questions regarding how Ritchie's solutions could be implemented. Rachel probes those questions, specifically on assumptions regarding whether or not countries will adopt renewables on the scale and speed needed to address the climate crisis, and how concepts such as degrowth factor into the future of the global economy. Ritchie says she intended to write an apolitical book, but with the multiple complex planetary environmental crises that are outlined in this book, it's hard for us to see how you address them without discussing policy or acknowledging political challenges. It's a great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hannah, thank you very much for joining me. Welcome to Mongabay's Newscast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Pleasure. So first of all, can you explain the title of your book, Not the End of the World?
Yeah, so my book is called Not the End of the World, and I think the way you say it really matters. I think there's a way of saying it, which is, oh, it's not the end of the world, and that's definitely not the way it's supposed to be titled. It's supposed to be a definitive, this is not the end of the world. We face urgent, massive environmental problems, but we have the capacity to solve them. And it's very much intended as a how-to, like these are the problems, but these are the potential solutions and how we solve them.
And so before we go into some of these solutions and how we can solve them, I think I want to get into the problems a little bit more. According to you, what is the cause of climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, etc.?
So the primary cause, I mean, I think they're all pretty strongly linked. It's humans exploiting resources. Now, the primary driver of climate change, as we know, is burning fossil fuels. There's a food component to that, so around a quarter of our emissions come from food systems, and we can come on to that. But 3/4 come from burning fossil fuels for energy. And over the since the Industrial Revolution, we've continued to burn increasing amounts of fossil fuels, and that emits CO2. And the solution to that is to move to an energy system where we're not burning fossil fuels, and I think we have the capacity to do that.
It's interesting you say that we have the capacity to do that, because some people dispute that. Some people, the International Energy Agency sort of warns against a mineral shortfall, that we can't go to a fully renewable economy. We will have to reduce our energy needs at some point. And also, there doesn't really seem to be the political will at the moment. I mean, if we look at what just happened in COP, the host country was using that as a forum to sell more fossil fuels, and their strategy for getting Africa hooked on fossil fuels was leaked to the public.
Yeah, so on the mineral question, there's very broad literature on this now, looking at the question of, do we have enough minerals to build one of the net zero emission scenarios? So that's international urgency or various other scenarios. And the conclusion there is that we do have enough minerals. We have plenty of minerals. Now, there's going to be challenges within that. We're going to massively shift supply chains. suppliers of minerals are going to change. We're going to move from countries that are producing fossil fuels to countries that are supplying minerals, and there are real environmental and social challenges with that, and we need to navigate that carefully. But in terms of like absolute amount of minerals, we do have enough minerals, and there are many analyses and academic papers showing this point. And on the political will point, like I agree. I think that's been a major barrier to date. I think for me, actually the biggest barrier to date has been the cost of these technologies. So a decade ago, solar, wind, batteries, heat pumps, they were way, way too expensive, right? You can say that that's because of fossil fuels in comparison were way too cheap, which is a valid criticism, but the price differential there just wasn't going to work, right? Rich countries would have to, and I think they should have, commit to financing these despite being more expensive. But you were never going to get middle and low income countries to do that because they were fighting this trade-off of energy poverty versus deploying low carbon technologies. Over the last decade, we've seen that completely transform, and these technologies are now cheaper. And we actually are seeing these technologies being deployed very, very quickly. Like the deployment of solar, from the IEA to the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, these projections for how quickly solar would grow have been beaten time after time after time. So the same for batteries and electric vehicles. Like we've continued to beat the projections. Now, the projections were probably just very, very low in the first place. But that is part of why I'm more optimistic than I was a decade ago, because we are smashing these barriers. We're also smashing temperature barriers, which we shouldn't be. But there is also, I think, for me, this case for optimism.
I hear it, right? And I think that with regards to, the deployment of renewable energy and the cost of renewable energy, all of that is going in the right direction. However, the rest isn't. Like, as you said, we're smashing temperature barriers. We seem to have consistently underestimated the impacts of climate change. Our oceans are acidifying. And so with regards to, I've read in the Guardian article that you sort of refer to yourself as a techno-realist. Could it be realistic to also say that we can have all of the technology available and deployed, but it's still not going to be enough to actually solve the problem? Because for now, it's not solving the problem. I mean, renewable energy is being deployed, but it's only being deployed on top of a continuingly growing extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. Emissions are still rising.
Emissions are still rising. They're rising much slower than they were a decade ago. So the growth in CO2 emissions is slowing dramatically, and the expectations is that I don't want to predict peaks because we always get peaks wrong, but the prediction is within maybe the next 3 years or so, global emissions will peak. Now, that's not good enough. We shouldn't be celebrating peaking when we should be on the downward trend, but we're not going to see this relentless growth in CO2 emissions. So I think we are going to start to hit the peak soon, and we need to then reduce emissions. But I get the message. For me, it's holding those two thoughts together at the same time. We're in a very bad position on our current trajectory on climate change, but these technologies are growing quickly. And I think what I'm trying to do is accelerate that.
But I suppose, what if we're wrong? Because this is the trajectory that we've been on for quite a while. The belief that technology will solve this problem. And if you leave it up to the free market, it will be able to enact quicker and better solutions than, international government policy. That has proven to be wrong time and time again because the situation keeps getting worse. What if we're wrong? Because accelerating on a trajectory that is proven to not really be working seems like quite a dangerous strategy on a planet that's on the brink of irreversible damage, according to the latest IPCC report.
So, my position is not that just free market economics is going to do it on its own. I think technology is a very important lever. And even if you were to go into a scenario of reducing economic growth, for example, or even degrowth, you still need that technology lever because we're going to need energy.
Sure.
You need less energy, but you still need energy. So we still need the technology lever. And for me, yes, it does need to be combined with government policy. That matters a lot. It even matters a lot for the cost of these technologies, right? A core part of the transition is not just deploying these technologies, but ensuring that they're deployed fairly and equitably across societies. And for it not just to go to rich consumers so they can have electric vehicles and they can have solar panels, then you need government policy to subsidise, redistribute and make sure that low-income households and countries are not left behind. So like I'm not in the position saying that it's just free market economics. I don't believe that.
That sounds a bit like degrowth, what you've just described.
Is it?
Yeah. I mean, the degrowth is about the understanding and redistribution of like an ecological budget. And so understanding that richer nations need to pull in and help other nations sort of use up and then manage their own ecological budget, which will be about, you know, the open access of technology, of ideas, of financing and all of that kind of thing.
Okay, so low and middle income countries still need to grow. And there's still welfare benefits to them growing their economies. And it's not acceptable for us to say that they can't grow their economies. So yes, they need to grow, which means global degrowth. On rich country growth or degrowth, I'm very agnostic.
So that's degrowth, right? It's that low and middle income countries do need to grow their economies in order to raise the standard of well-being and access to education, housing, healthcare, all of these kinds of things. But in order to do that within planetary boundaries, we need to cap the continued expansion of the economic growth of wealthier countries, which have gone sort of far and beyond, you know, well-being.
Okay, I'm not strictly advocating degrowth in rich countries. So I'm agnostic, like you can say I'm agnostic to growth. I think there are a range of different metrics that we can focus on and are more appropriate to focus on. But you need global growth, and on rich countries I'm agnostic. If that is the definition of degrowth, then okay, that's degrowth.
It seems a bit surprising to me that you don't understand the definition of degrowth when you lambasted it in the book as not being a solution. No, I mean, that's what I said in the book. I said in the book that we need global growth because we need low and middle income countries to grow. And then on rich countries, there are massive welfare benefits to redistribution. Whether you have very strong economic growth in those countries doesn't really matter if you're focusing on all their metrics. But what do you mean by that? Focusing on all their metrics?
Well, other metrics of well-being or having other priorities. Like, I don't believe in this North Star of GDP growth in rich countries as like what we should be maximising or growth at all costs. I mean, economic growth is basically just the increase in value of goods and services within an economy. And if rich countries are doing that in a way that's reducing carbon emissions, is becoming more efficient, and their GDP grows, then I'm not against that. So my focus is not on whether GDP in rich countries should be falling or rising, whereas I think often degrowth is framed as it has to fall. My point is that it doesn't have to fall.
Okay, let's keep ticking at this because I think this will really interest a lot of people. What you've just described here is decoupling emissions from energy and emissions from environmental impact. And I know that Our World in Data has published, in 2021, you published a piece about decoupling and how a number of rich countries were achieving that. That got a lot of pushback from the degrowth community who sort of took your graphs and went, well, actually, no, I'm not a data scientist, but if you do X and Y and Z to it, then they're not decoupling because you're not including consumption emissions or etc. Please go on.
Yeah, no. I think so. You take Jason Higgle, for example. His criticism, and he's said very explicitly that you do see decoupling of CO2 emissions from growth, and that's also true when you take in consumption-based emissions. So, taking into account offshoring, many countries have decoupled emissions from growth. I think the argument there is that it's not happening fast enough, and I completely agree on that. I think that's the sticking point.
This warrants an extra note here. Researchers published a study in Environmental Science and Policy in 2020. They reviewed 179 articles on decoupling published between 1990 through 2019. Stated in the highlights of this research is that there was no evidence of economy-wide, national, or international absolute resource decoupling, no evidence of the kind of decoupling needed for ecological sustainability, and in the absence of robust evidence, the goal of decoupling rests partly on faith. But In regards to what Ritchie is referring to here, specifically decoupling consumption-based emissions, another study was published in Advances of Applied Energy in 2021, and states in its highlights that 23 countries achieved absolute decoupling between GDP and consumption-based emissions, but only between 2015 and 2018. And decoupling is temporary. Decoupled countries may switch back to increasing emissions.
I don't think the consensus, though, is that we can decouple entirely. Like, there has been some minor decoupling, but from what I understand, some pushback that I've seen against this decoupling claim from OID has been that some emissions have just been totally removed from the equation, like emissions of aviation, for example. And obviously these then massively benefit wealthy nations because the vast majority of our emissions have been offshored in some way. And like aviation, which only accounts for like 3% of global emissions, it's like heavily weighted per capita. And so to not include certain pieces of data misrepresents the global picture, which is that as rich nations grow, they are causing a massively inequitable destruction to the planet.
Rich countries account for a disproportionate amount of emissions. Like, that's very clear from the data. And when you look at historical data, that's even more skewed. Like, yeah, rich countries have contributed a massive amount to the problem, and they still, especially on a per person basis, produce a lot of emissions, especially when you account for consumption-based emissions. But they have achieved decoupling, and no matter how you slice the data, they have reduced emissions while growing their economies, which is absolute decoupling.
I find that interesting that you say no matter how you slice the data, because there are other models that slice the data differently and show very different results, that they are not achieving absolute decoupling, and that everything is still continuing to rise. I mean, surely we all know, like, the thing that data scientists love to say is like, all models are wrong, but some are useful. It matters how we interpret this.
Yeah, but I'm confused by what data you're referring to. Like, if you look at rich country emissions, they're going down, and this is acknowledged in the degrowth literature. Like, the contention is around the pace, and I agree on the pace that the emissions are not falling fast enough. Like, especially if you're talking about like a 1.5 target, they're not falling anywhere near fast enough, but they are falling.
Right. Okay. Let's move on. So I put a call out on Twitter yesterday to people saying, like, you know, is there anything you'd like me to ask Hannah? And this question surprised me, but quite a few people wanted me to ask you. And it was, how would you define a doomer?
Oh, I mean, I think this like is easy to misinterpret. Like, a doomer is not someone that thinks climate change is going to be really bad, or even someone that thinks climate change is going to be really catastrophic, because I fall into that camp. A doomer is, I refer to a doomer as someone that promotes the message of, this is so bad that there's nothing we can do about it. I think for me, it's the referral to our inability to tackle this, or the sense of inaction, which I think is potentially damaging. So it's not about how bad you think it's going to be, or even a particular like camp, like a degrowth camp or a techno-optimist camp. It's nothing about that. It's about whether we have the capacity to tackle it.
Okay, and can you like name some, because you talked about like leading climate activists that are broadcasting this sort of like doomer opinion, and I couldn't think of one actually. Do you have one at hand?
I mean, Roger Hallam has said that 6 billion people are going to die by the end of the century, and he's a very big voice in this space. And that's just not, he said it was backed up by the science, but that's not backed up by the science.
But he is still agitating for change. He is still, like, he's an activist. That's what he does full time. So even though he might be very pessimistic about what the end of the century looked like, he's not saying we can't do anything.
I don't think that's the message that's coming across. I think the message that's coming across from him is that this is pretty much locked in, and nothing but complete revolution is going to change that.
Okay. But there's quite a lot of pushback, I would say, from a lot of like activists around the world, including and scientists, and even the latest IPCC report, I think we can both agree, was the most radical to date. And it's a report that is, by definition, watered down by government. So you can only imagine what the first draft looked like. That we do need mass scale changes to our societies and how we organize if we're going to combat this. And I suppose throughout the book, I was very surprised when talking about a problem of this nature that's so global and that's so interconnected. You didn't really discuss politics or economics. The one thing that you had to say about capitalism was that we don't really have time to change it, which seems to be sort of a similar reflection of that Doomerism, saying, well, this is just how it's going to be and that's what we're going to have to work with. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think you can fair to call me a doomer on degrowth, because I think if you take the example of the 1.5 degree target, right? I'm very explicit, and I agree that like decoupling or green growth is not going to get us there, right? We're going to go past 1.5 degrees. But if you look at the carbon budget that we've got left, like we've got like 5 years of current levels of emissions. For me, and maybe I'm wrong. Like maybe you have a different opinion. For me, like I don't see how in the next 5 years you're going to get mass scale political buy-in for degrowth. Not only to just get like a leader to stand up and promote that as a core policy, but also to then get voters to vote for that and get them into government, and then also to enact that in the space of 5 years. And that would not need to be done by just one country. You would need this on a massive scale. So for me, like those timelines don't make sense. So like green growth is not going to get us to 1.5 degrees, but I also don't see degrowth getting us to 1.5 degree. Degrowth getting us to 1.5 degrees. So if that makes me a degrowth doomer, then that makes me a degrowth doomer.
But I think that's interesting because you're saying that we don't have the political buy-in, we don't have the political will to enact real change. I mean, you could argue that it's that same lack of political will that makes this trajectory of like, oh, it's fine, we'll just move to renewables and that'll just sort of sort itself out. Like, tech will come in and save the day and, we will redistribute and yada, yada, yada. Like, there is something fundamentally broken about our global politics if we can't even find the political will to stop at 1.5 degrees warming, or even before. I mean, the fact that we got here in the first place. And so this was a question I had, I suppose, when I got to the end of your book was, why do you think that the political will be there to implement the solutions that you've suggested as well?
I think for me, one of the reasons that I'm quite explicitly non-political, and that's just a position I take because I think being strongly political in this space makes me less effective. There are lots of people heavily invested in the politics of this.
But this is a very political book, even though you don't talk about politics directly.
No, I try to explicitly stay away from politics. I don't see it as being political.
But I mean,
I actually did an interview in the New York Times, and the interviewer there, that's what he was pushing me on. He was saying there's nothing in this book. He was saying you're like very strictly non-political.
Well, what I would suppose, let me clarify, like everything is politics, right? And the fact that you're apolitical in this book is a form of politics. And the fact that you don't question capitalism is a form of politics.
The reason I'm political is because apolitical is because I'm coming at this from a scientific background. Now, people disagree with me on this, and that's fine. But for me, I think it's like a really important part of scientific input is trying to be non-partisan and non-political. Like a lot of it is about not giving policy prescriptions. It's about saying the purpose of science is saying these are the problems, and it's really important to stress the scale of the problems. These are the impacts. It's effective for scientists to say these are the potential solutions. If you do this, then this is the outcome. If you do this, then this is the outcome. What I don't think the position of scientists is to give policy prescriptions. And yeah,
sure, but you do advocate for capitalism, for growth, and say that degrowth isn't a solution. All three of which are political stances.
I argue for global growth, because I like a core part of the book is not just about tackling environmental problems. It's about trying to match lifting people out of poverty, increasing human well-being, while also tackling our environmental problems at the same time. And to me, these two things can be compatible.
Absolutely.
Now, the what I tackle, like, it's on 2 pages of the book. Like, a chapter by chapter, I go through each of the environmental problems. And at the start, I explicitly say there are 2 things that I'm going to say very briefly. And the reason I do that is because in each of the chapters, I try to go into really, really specific solutions. And I think the reason at the start I said what I'm going to discuss very briefly up front is depopulation and degrowth. And the reasons why I don't think these are like complete catch-all solutions to the rest of the problems in the book, because my concern was that people would go through and see all these really specific solutions and then they just say, oh, it's just about population, or just about capitalism or economic growth. So at the start, I say very explicitly, like, this is my stance on depopulation, this is my stance on degrowth, and then I go into really specific solutions.
Yes, but that stance on growth or not growth, degrowth, capitalism, will impact your bias, surely, though, as you interpret data. And then as will also impact like the solutions that you are prescribing. They might not be policy solutions, but they are political. And I think for me, it was just quite difficult to engage sometimes with just saying that capitalism's what we've got, we don't have time to change it. And there being no critique of the fact that, you want to improve global well-being for everybody, which is an admirable goal. And I applaud your definition of sustainability as including human well-being. But in the system of capitalism and growth, the one that we live in right now, only 0.07% of income growth gets to the global 10%. And the richest 1% emit as much pollution as 2/3 of humanity. This is an inequality problem. This is an inequity problem. And it seems very strange to me that when we have those figures from everyone from Oxfam to the World Inequality Lab, that it wouldn't be addressed at all in the book. And then it makes the rest of the claims that capitalism cannot be addressed, just sort of makes it very difficult to engage with it because there seems to be no analysis of it.
I'm very explicit in the book that it's an inequality problem. Like, I break down, these are where emissions are coming from. The rich countries have massively more emissions per person. Historically, they've contributed far, far more to the problem. The impacts of climate change are going to be disproportionately on low-income countries. That means the solution to this is that rich countries need to get emissions to zero as quickly as they can. They also need to support low-income countries, one in terms of mitigation and adaptation, the other in terms of loss and damage. Like, I'm very, very explicit that it's an inequality problem.
But you also say rich countries and rich people live cleaner lives, and the data would suggest otherwise.
On air pollution, for example, it's very clear that they live cleaner lives. They don't live, in terms of like CO2 emissions, they don't live cleaner lives than someone at very, very low incomes. They live cleaner lives than someone in that country a couple of decades ago because those emissions were higher. But no, I'm not saying that the CO2 emissions of a person in a rich country are lower than someone in a low-income country. That's not true.
Do you think that we will have to cap the emissions of the wealthy at some point? Just for a piece of data, millionaires are on track to use up 73% of the carbon budget by 2030. Millionaires alone.
I don't see a viable pathway by which that would be implemented.
Okay, so are some of these solutions then, like, is some of this techno-realism grounded in it might be really difficult to get the wealthy and the powerful to change their minds and change their behavior? So this is like the acceptable set, or like the accessible set of solutions that we have right now.
I think in general, behavior change is very hard. And actually, like, it's not that I don't advocate for any behavior change in the book. Like, some of the changes are actually quite big. So I don't think this is we can get away with no behavior changes whatsoever. But I think in general, yes, for me, behavior change, like, across the spectrum, seems very difficult, yeah.
But the behavior of the wealthy is disproportionately impacting the planet and other people. So is it that with within the framework of it will be very hard to get them to change their minds and change their behavior. Here instead is a set of what you consider accessible solutions at this stage.
Yes, I think behavior change in general is hard. I think, and I don't think that's just for rich people. I think behavior change in general is just hard. Yes, rich people have more carbon intensive lifestyles. And the point is that most people in the world are going to try to aspire to those lifestyles, whether we like it or not. So that would be the trajectory. Therefore, yes, you can have some behavior changes, but you also need to find a way to decarbonize many of the behaviors that probably people will not just change behaviors on.
Can you see then why some people are advocating for revolution rather than just for sort of tweaking the status quo? And for saying that like this kind of wealth inequality cannot continue to exist because of, as you just said, as people aspire to have like wealthier lifestyles and more carbon intensive lifestyle, the more people who are sort of risen out of poverty, the greater impact that's going to have on the planet.
Yeah, but the development, so the development pathways of people in low-income countries are not going to be anywhere near the carbon intensity of the UK or the US or any of these countries, because they will just switch to much lower carbon energy sources because they'll be there and they will be cheaper. So they can rise to a high standard of living with a relatively low carbon footprint.
But this, low carbon technologies will be available and will be cheaper. They're currently available and cheaper and they're not being deployed because there's huge amounts of like geopolitical and economic forces that deliberately subsidize fossil fuels, that ensure that fossil fuels get sort of a head start in certain countries. We saw that strategy being played out at COP28 and the idea to get Africa hooked, quote unquote, on fossil fuels. So, technology might be agnostic, but politics isn't. What makes you think that this will just happen?
I don't think it will just happen.
Okay.
Like, we need to make it happen. But these technologies are being deployed quickly. They're being deployed far quickly than we would have anticipated because their prices have fallen much lower than we would have expected. So solar and wind, like on electricity, though those technologies are cheaper than fossil fuels. When it comes to transport, say someone getting hooked on a gasoline car, so the alternative there, preferably it would be public transport or walking or cycling. If that's not there, then, okay, the alternative is an electric car. Now, electric cars are basically just reaching the point where they're becoming economically competitive with gasoline cars. And those are new cars, and they're for a while, there won't be many on the used car market. So in terms of the trajectory of transport, it's going to take a little while. It will be this decade where electric cars will be significantly lower than gasoline. And then you will start to see that transition.
So it's going to be sort of 10 years until these kinds of tweaks in tech will start to have a sort of natural impact on the market or start to be able to outweigh the political market forces that already exist. Is that sort of what you're saying?
No, solar and wind are already there.
Sure.
They're already being deployed extremely quickly. When it comes to electric cars, electric cars in many countries are growing really rapidly. Like 1 in 3 new cars in China this year was electric, and that curve is going extremely quickly. So yes, we will be looking at towards the end of the decade when the majority of car sales will be electric.
But I guess the thing is, like, electric vehicles get a lot of airtime. But as you said in your book, the number one desire is public transport and walking and cycling if you can. And the focus on EV seems to be like a continuation of the same problem, which is sort of, everybody has their own personal property. And it seems like a huge amount of like minerals and mining and ecological damage and the pressure on planetary boundaries for a technology that most people who have it, i.e. the wealthy, don't actually need it at the moment.
I think the issue I have with that is how you tell people what they need and don't need, and who makes the decision of what people need and don't need. So like, I don't have a car. Like I live in a city, I walk, I cycle. If I'm traveling, I take the train. But for many people, that's not accessible, and they don't live in a dense city. They live in a rural area, or they live in a suburb. And like there are people where the car is an option, it is the only option to get to work. Now, yes, like I'm absolutely in favour of increasing public transport, but I also think it's an issue to tell people you need this and you don't need this, because then it's a question of who gets to make the decision of what a person needs and doesn't need.
I get that. And that's actually like, that's typically trotted out as a Tory line, right? Like they're guarding your freedoms. And yet we're told all the time what we can do, what we can buy. You know, it's governments that decide what goods are coming in and out of the market. It's them that are setting prices. It's them that are subsidizing certain industries. Like this pretense that consumers get to advocate for their freedom with their purchasing power seems to be buying into a fallacy that is allowing people to exploit that very ideology in order to make profit out of a very serious planetary crisis.
Are governments setting the price of solar power?
Sorry? Well, I mean, I suppose when, you know, China, which is sort of like the supply chain of minerals going in and out of the world, when it engages in its like tariff warfare with the United States or goes to negotiate with the European Union, yes, like these relationships are impacting prices all the time.
They impact prices, but the price differential in the end is not only determined by what a government says the price is. Yes, the government can influence via subsidies what the price differential of a electric car versus a petrol car, or the price of your heat pump. Yes, there's ways that you can subsidise and change that. And like I'm very much in favour of subsidising these low carbon technologies, especially for low income households. But they don't just magically just set any price that they want.
No, but I didn't say that they magically do. I'm just saying that governments impact, like the government, the market every day impacts how people live their lives. And so this rhetoric that we shouldn't stop people from making certain choices or get to tell them how to think or what, like that's happening all the time anyway. So I find it like disingenuous. The thing that I wanted to ask you about with regards to nature, this is Mongabay, so a lot of our listeners right now will be, you know, really wanting to get into that. You used a war metaphor repeatedly throughout the book, which really surprised me. That we are at war with other life. We are at war with animals. We have always been at war with wildlife. Why?
Because we are competing with other animals for space and resources.
But does that mean we're at war? I mean, that's kind of just what happens within ecosystems, and we are part of this planet's ecosystems.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, the main metaphor I'm using there is that we are competing with other animals for space, for habitat, for forest, for resources.
Sure. I found that it kind of created like almost and maybe this was unintentional, but like a binary between like nature and humans. And then I can't remember which chapter it was, but it was towards the end of the book. You said, you know, we are a part of nature. We are, and it was really heartening to me. But I was surprised by like, it was quite violent imagery the way through. And to me, it almost set up this opposition kind of like generates a justification sometimes for how we treat nature. That was my reading of it. I'm not saying that was what you intended.
Oh, no, I mean, I intended the opposite. Like, I think the core part coming through is that we've been incredibly destructive to nature. And I think that's ultimately where the war metaphor comes from. I mean, there are like various debates on how we should relate to nature, like, and from a like conservation and protection point of view. Should it be humans over here, we leave the rest of the stuff for other wildlife? Or should it be that we create environments where we're interacting with nature and we are like sharing that area with species? And there's various academic debates on whether it's one or the other.
Yeah, we had that debate recently on the podcast. It was really fascinating. All of the work that's going into rewilding. Another thing that I want to sort of pull you up on, if I may, is the sort of subtitle of your book and this claim that we can be the first generation to leave the environment in a better state than we found it. Now, Mongabay listeners and readers will be very au fait with the positive impacts of indigenous populations on their community, the necessity of indigenous populations to healthy ecosystems, and the positive impact of environmental defenders. So that really stuck out to me as a very Eurocentric claim.
No, so the subtitle of the book is How We Can Be the First Sustainable Generation. And I go into a lot of detail on what I mean by the definition of sustainability there. And it's not just about the environmental impact. So if you go on the basis of environmental impact, there's no way you can claim that we're the first sustainable generation. In many ways, we're the most destructive generation. And there are many generations that have come before us that have lived in very good balance with nature and have protected nature. But the definition I put forward in the book of sustainability is also the component of human suffering and human well-being. And the argument that I'm making in the book is that if you take these as two halves of an equation, we've never really managed to completely balance those. So we've been very protective of nature in the past, but often there were metrics of human suffering that were bad. So like I take the example of child mortality, where child mortality rates were extremely high. Now, over the last few centuries, we've completely tipped that balance, right? On many metrics of human well-being, things have improved, but that's came at a massive cost of the environment. So we've had the scales in one way, and now they've tipped the other way. And the argument I'm making in the book is that I think it's not incompatible that we manage to achieve both of these things at the same time, right? I think we can provide high standards of living, strong human well-being, whilst also reducing our environmental impact. So that's the core argument.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. That's helpful. One thing that I noticed in the book was that you didn't refer to some of these terms that we've been using today, like planetary boundaries, or tipping points, or ecological footprints. You didn't refer to these in the book. And I was wondering why you chose to omit these frameworks that are sort of being used now very regularly in scientific journals and also in government policy.
So I discuss tipping points. I discuss what's the role of the 1.5 and the 2 degrees targets, and the fact that once we start to get into those temperature ranges, we are at risk of reaching climatic tipping points. I don't talk about explicitly planetary boundaries, although a lot of what I cover in the book directly relates to them. So deforestation, nitrogen pollution, species extinction, for example. I cover those in detail in the book, although I don't necessarily say this is the boundary, you were on one side of it or the other side of it. For me, yes, on many of these, I think some of the issue I have with the boundary is that it's too explicit in trying to give a really quantifiable boundary there, whereas I think often these impacts are regional, and often to me there's not a clear boundary where you can say on this side it's fine or on that side it's not fine. But I'm very explicit on the book on many of these metrics. If you were to consider it a very bad zone, we're in the very, very bad zone. But it's not. I kind of contest that there's a really, really definitive boundary.
Because some impacts might be felt quicker in some places and slower in others, or just that these things are actually difficult to quantify and we shouldn't be putting a definitive boundary on them?
So I think if you take the example of nitrogen pollution, so fertilizer running off into waterways, to me there's not a very, very if any amount of nitrogen running off into these waterways is polluting and is bad. And to me there's not necessarily a highly quantifiable boundary where if you are above a certain amount you're past the boundary, and if you're below it it's fine. To me you should just try to get that as close to zero as you possibly can.
But how can you get these things close to zero? And you say this throughout your book that, trying to get certain things close to zero, like emissions. How can we get things close to zero if we're not trying to get them absolutely close to zero? And if we're not also reducing our impact on the planet by reducing our growth, our consumption?
I mean, many of these things you can get really close to zero. There is a viable path. Now, how long it takes us to get there is a viable path by which we can get to very low, if not zero, carbon emissions, right? There is a viable pathway to that. Now, the question is what timescale we do that on, and hopefully the sooner the better. There is a viable pathway by which we can have a very, very little nitrogen running off our land and polluting waterways. Like, there is a viable path to that. There is a viable path to us ending deforestation. Like, I think on many of these metrics that would be considered planetary boundaries, there is a viable path to getting it to zero.
I'm glad you brought up deforestation. I found that chapter very interesting. This was something that I investigated sort of at the beginning of my career as a climate corruption journalist. And one of the things that I found sort of most frightening was that very regularly governments will deliberately misreport their deforestation. And there are some NGOs that are using like satellite data to try and track what's going on. But it's actually very difficult to know what's happening with our forests around the world. And you said that what happens is like at a point of wealth, nations will start to regrow their forests. So deforestation has a peak and then it starts to descend. Is that not because these wealthy nations can go and then deforest other parts of the world? Like Indonesia, for example, in West Papua. It's not that the overall rate of deforestation or consumption of trees in the world is decreasing. It's actually increasing all the time. I mean, this is what happens when we are, as you say, like competing over resources. Unless we find that we no longer need that resource, we will still keep hunting it.
Yeah, so if you look through what's called the forest transition theory, where countries cut down forests initially for wood, for fuel, and then the primary driver of forest deforestation is agriculture. So they expand agricultural land and they cut down forest, and then they get to a stage where agricultural land is very productive and they have they have other sources of energy, so they don't need wood anymore, and then the deforestation starts to decline, and in some countries it starts to regrow. So like the UK is a good example where we cut down our forests like centuries ago, and we'd reached actually a very, very low point, and then they've started to rebound. Now, for many countries, they have then displaced deforestation primarily through the products that they import, right? So the UK is a net importer of deforestation because they're buying goods that have been grown on deforested land in our country, and that's a problem. Yeah, that's a problem. I think it's a increasingly tractable problem because we can better track these supply chains. Like there are now projects coming online, like Trace, for example, is doing really good work on trying to track food products through supply chains and link them back to countries. Like there's a report out today actually looking specifically at imported deforestation from in the UK, and it's high. But I think then we're in a phase where we actually have the capacity to address this because we do now have satellite technologies. We can improve transparency in supply chains.
So the forest transition theory is relevant when looking at a piece of territory, but when you take in the global picture, countries that have gone through a forest transition can still be net importers of deforestation.
Yeah, it's the forest transition theory works on a domestic basis, and it gets more complex when you look internationally here.
Right, okay. Again, it's this like zooming out to the big picture, which seems to be really important of how we, understand the data in front of us. And on that, a piece in The Guardian came out yesterday on you. There was an interview and also an extract from the book. And it's set my part of Twitter ablaze. I'm not sure about yours. And one of the claims that I saw was warning against what we call blended metrics, or averaging data. And there were some claims that this is a sort of deliberate obfuscation, because it doesn't really matter if per capita emissions are dropping, for example. The fact that absolute emissions are rising is what's most important, because the atmosphere doesn't care where the emissions come from, just that they're coming. How would you respond to that claim that it's a deliberate obfuscation?
I mean, I don't only discuss per capita emissions. I also discuss, actually in the book I discuss per capita emissions I discuss total emissions. I discuss historical emissions, like historical cumulative responsibility. Like I present a range of metrics. I don't only present per capita.
But the narrative throughout the book is that things are getting better. So per capita emissions are dropping, or your emissions are less than your grandparents, or domestic story of like deforestation is dropping, even though when you zoom out, actually it's rising.
I don't say that every metric's getting better. Like I say in the book, yes, like UK emissions have dropped, but globally they're still rising. Deforestation has decreased in some places, but it has increased in others.
Sure. So how would you respond then to this claim that blended metrics is not the best way to actually interpret the data for a big picture overview?
No, I agree. You need to present a range of metrics. You can't only use one metric.
How do you choose what metrics to look at out of interest?
I mean, I usually try to present multiple, because I think it's quite rare that only one metric, no single metric tells the entire story. So I try to pick a range of metrics. Actually, a lot of it comes from, in urban data, we learn a ton from interacting with people that use our data. Like we see how people debate around it, like what questions people have. Like on CO2 emissions, for example, like it's very common that you'll see like a whole thread of people arguing back and forward where they're using our own data charts, but one is using per capita, and they say, no, you have to look at total country emissions. And then someone says, no, you need to look at historical responsibility. So we try to make as many of these metrics available as possible so that people can then have these debates between themselves. Like we would never just present per capita CO2 on our own data.
Sure. No, of course. I'm not suggesting that you've only presented per capita, but I'm just saying that the narrative often when things are getting better is that it's often these blended metrics that are presented as showing how things are getting better. And that was one of the complaints that came out on Twitter about Owood and about this work.
On our own data, we cover a really broad range of topics. Like we cover climate, environment, like energy, poverty, malaria, child mortality, maternal mortality, war, peace. Like we cover a really, really broad range of topics. And the key part of that is because, you cannot pick just one metric or a few metrics to synthesize how the world is changing. So we try to present a really, really broad range of topics. And within those, there's never just a single metric. There's a really broad range of metrics. And we try to make the data as accessible for people as possible so they can explore the stories because they're broken down in different ways.
But how do you pick the metrics to make a point?
We're usually not trying to make a point. We select metrics that are, and often the metrics, the metrics are often coming from international organizations like the WHO, for example, who have a really broad set of metrics, and we try to actually show as many of those as possible. So we try to show all of the different health metrics.
But in this book, you've chosen a set of metrics in order to illustrate a point. How did you choose them?
Because I chose the metrics that you can't show every single metric in a book.
So how did you choose them?
Because I chose them on the basis of what were the important metrics that I think tell the full story.
So this is a story that is told through your bias then?
I try to be as impartial as I can, but yeah, sure, probably I've got some bias.
Well, I think it was something that stood out as a journalist and who studied, theory and objectivity. It's just not something that we can achieve, really. And it was debunked a long time ago. And I think, this saying that we only look at data and we're just interpreting the data and the data must be objective. Like the whole steps of bias that we go through in order to engage with data and choose what we put in a book in order to illustrate the point that you think is a good story. I think that's a really important thing to say to people. This book is going to have a huge impact because, you're backed by Bill Gates, Elon Musk, all of these guys.
I'm not backed by Elon Musk.
He funds OID.
He didn't. He's never looked at the book.
Oh, right. But okay, sure. But he funds the organization, doesn't he?
Yeah, the Musk Foundation has given us a grant, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, OID is backed by, and you're the director of OID. So, I mean, it goes to say this is going to have a huge impact, and like claiming that you can be objective where others cannot seems to be quite startling.
Oh, I'm not claiming I'm objective where no one else is.
All right. Okay. Because throughout the book, it sort of, writes off a lot of other science and claims, and calls people, doomers or deniers, depending where you are on the scale, if they don't agree.
I used the term doomer in a specific context of, I don't think the messaging of it's too late, we can do nothing, we can't do anything about this. Like, I don't think that's a useful message. I don't go throughout the book saying this person's doomer and this person's, like, I say it like maybe twice in the introduction, and I never say doomer in the rest of the book. It's
in your conclusion as well. You have a figure showing where people are on a map. Yeah, and doomer is there. So I think we could agree. Opinions inform how we choose to interpret data or what metrics we choose to publish. OID is supported by effective altruists, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and I've seen you've interviewed Bill Gates, and he's backing the book. He's he's read it, he's supported it. How much influence do these donors have on OID, on the kinds of metrics that you choose to publish, on the direction of the organization?
So we have a range of funders. So we're set up as a non-profit. So we're a combination of based at the University of Oxford, and we have a non-profit branch called the Global Change Data Lab. And we are funded through either reader donations or philanthropic donations, because we're a non-profit. So we've been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've been funded by Quadrature Climate Foundation and various other foundations. Now those grants are, and we're like very, very strict on this, those grants are given as largely unrestricted grants, and they get zero say in what we publish. Like, none of our funders has ever told us, you need to publish this, not even you need to focus on this. Like, we've actually been, like, I'd say quite lucky in the fact that we have good funders that trust us to do the work that we think is important. And they've had zero say in what we publish or what metrics we choose, or even what topics we focus on.
Relatively what topics? That means they have had some say in some topics?
I mean, so the Quadrature Climate Foundation, we've been given a grant there to focus on climate and energy. Now, they've not told us specifically what on climate and energy we need to do, but like, we need to deliver work on the topic of climate and energy. Or the WHO, the World Health Organization, has given us stuff for health. We can't take that money and then say we're going to do stuff on deforestation with that.
Yeah, of course. Do you think that they would support OID if OID was publishing data that went against what they, sell? And I mean, this is a very open-ended question. I didn't prepare this.
Yeah, I think so.
You think they would support?
I mean, yeah.
Okay. What do you think about Bill Gates' claim that 3 degrees warming isn't all that bad?
I think 3 degrees warming is bad. Like, I think 2 degrees warming is very bad, and we need to do as much as we can to stay below 2 degrees.
So what do you think your book will have as an impact on people like him, who have a huge amount of personal and political and economic power?
I think that maybe there's stuff that Bill Gates disagrees with me on, and I would hope that the hopes of the book is that I drive action and drive momentum. Like, the core part of the book is that these problems are big and they're urgent, but I think we have the capacity to solve them, and we need to move very quickly, but I think we can. So the core, what I hope to achieve with the book is to drive action, not complacency.
Okay. I mean, I hope any any piece of work that aims to drive action successfully does. But I think, what impact do you think this might have on the public's perception of activists who are putting their bodies on the line and warning about the dangers, or scientists that are putting their bodies on the line as activists and warning about the dangers? And you essentially saying that it's not as bad, it's not that bad, and we have the tech to solve it. Do you think that you could do damage to the global activist network movement worldwide?
No, I'm very supportive of the global activist movement. Like, this is not a either or. Like, I think activists do a fantastic job. I'm a scientist. I've written a book. I do data analysis. We do different things, but we're trying to contribute positively to the same problem. And the message of the book is not that trying to downplay the issue or say that this is not a big problem. Like, I'm very, very clear, like, we're on a path for 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming, and that is catastrophic. And we need to urgently bring that down. So that, like, I'm not downplaying the issue in any way.
But a lot of your language does. I mean, at the beginning, when you say that you thought things were much worse than they actually are, and that people need to stress less, that is fundamentally downplaying.
No, I'm not. No, I don't say that we need to stress less about the overall issue. Like, chapter by chapter, I have a section at the end that says things to stress less about. Now, the core part of that is that there are often particular things that people think will make a big difference or will work, and the data and the research is like goes against that and says, like, if you want to tackle climate change and there's 5 behaviors you can do, like, let's optimize the ones that have the biggest impact. And there are certain behaviors that people really stress about that actually have a really low impact. So I'm trying to differentiate these are the tiny things that don't matter from, like, these are the big things that we need to do because we need to move urgently. So the things to stress less about is not to stress less about the problem as a whole. It's about specific behaviors that are not effective in reducing emissions.
Okay, sure. I think it's impossible to sort of discuss how it might be interpreted, obviously. But so I interpreted it as, like, worry less, it's not that bad. And I found that very worrying, given the state that we're in today and the amount of sort of urgency and action, government action, market action, individual action that needs to happen.
I mean, the aim of the book is to accelerate action. And we're coming from this from different mentalities, maybe have different frameworks for. I mean, I think a core part of human psychology is that, like, audiences respond differently to different messages. Mm-hmm. And part of my thesis is that often people respond positively to seeing momentum, right? The worst position you can be in is feeling like you've been trying for decades and decades and making no progress whatsoever. Then you kind of reach this fatigue where you say, oh, like, I feel like there's actually just nothing we can do now. What I'm trying to do is show, like, we haven't made enough progress by far, but we have made some progress, and there is stuff to build on there, and we need to take that momentum to drive action further. And I guess my hypothesis is that some people that does work for some people, and it does drive them to take more action. And that's often the feedback I get, is that people, after reading this sort of work, feel like I'm motivated now and energized now to get going.
And what kind of steps do they take?
I don't know. They email me and stuff, so I don't know specifically what they take, but they get involved in community groups, or they get involved in activist groups, or I also just get really dark emails at times. Like, I get emails from people that are stuck in a really dark place. Mm-hmm. Like, they don't feel like they actually explicitly say, like, I don't feel like there's anything left to live for, and I think that's part of what I'm trying to push against, is that, like, I completely emphasize that position because I've been in that position in the past. So what I'm trying to do is, like, for those people to say, no, like, there is stuff that we can do, like, we are making progress, like, we just need to accelerate it. Now, that message is not going to land for everyone, and that's okay.
I've got one final question for you, and then I promise I'll let you go if you have the time. Based on everything we've discussed and everything in your book, the solutions and also the debates that we've had here around, the redistribution of riches, capping the rich. Say you had a magic wand, right, that had all of the political will and all of the economic force in your hand. What is the one thing that you would do, the first thing that you would do that you think would have the biggest positive impact?
Because I want multiple.
Go on, top three.
Oh, top three. I mean, for me, like, although I've written an environment book, like, for me, the biggest problem we still face today is the levels of poverty in the world. Mm. So I would bring everyone in the world up to a good level of income. That would be my number one. My number two would be to have cheap, abundant, clean energy for everyone. That would be my next one. And my third one would be to be able to produce nutritious food on a tiny fraction of the land that we do today, because that's the leading driver of deforestation. That's a leading driver of biodiversity loss, and everyone in the world deserves a affordable, nutritious diet.
Okay. I think I'm with you on the first two. The third, I would swap out. I mean, food's important, don't get me wrong, but I think I'd swap in something about like a very rich and diverse human and more than human culture around the world. And if I may, Hannah, that sounds a lot like degrowth. I'm gonna send you some stuff after this interview. Okay, it sounds a lot like degrowth. Yeah. Listen, Hannah, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for your patience. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was a difficult interview, and for me, it really highlighted the power dynamics of interviews in a sense, because Hannah Ritchie, or Our World and Data, she's kind of known, I guess, if you're in this space. Our World and Data is fairly well known, but her writing this book, which is being endorsed by Bill Gates, takes her and her work and her name and everything to like a new power dynamic. And I just I think especially around the degrowth bit, where we just kept going back and forth of maybe, no, that's not true. And her saying, yes, countries have decoupled, and me going, no, they haven't. And eventually just having to move the conversation on. And I was stunned by, it's a small piece of misinformation. And I was stunned by the process of being like, but that's not true. And at what point, like, the power dynamics of a journalist and a guest, what do you do in that situation if somebody's not budging? It was interesting for me.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll start, because I have some thoughts on the degrowth decoupling aspect. Yeah, I had some big questions. One of them was the degrowth thing, and that was a really interesting conversation that you had there. She does talk about degrowth in the chapter, and then there's also this decoupling aspect. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds in this, but for listeners, there's two things. There's called absolute decoupling and relative decoupling. Absolute decoupling means that the environmental impact is either in stasis or in reduction relative to one economic variable. I'll say that again. So it's either there's an environmental impact that is either in stasis or reducing while one economic variable is increasing. That is absolute decoupling. Relative decoupling is when that environmental impact is actually increasing, but at a lower rate than the economic variable is increasing. So I just wanted to give a quick definition there of the one that I read from the OECD. That being said, the OECD has outlined that decoupling, they say decoupling has been observed, but there's actually parts of the economy that have not decoupled still. But I also want to outline that they say in this 3-page summary on the indicators to measure decoupling of environmental pressure from economic growth. There's this little 3-page summary that they have. You can find it on the internet. They do say that decoupling indicators tell only part of the story and do not take into account of the environment's capacity to withstand pressures or cross-border flows of pollutants. So I think that's really important. So even the OECD environment program here is admitting that it doesn't tell the whole story. And I think that's kind of the main point here. And obviously, Rachel, you know a lot more about degrowth than I do, but it appears that that central point I don't think Hannah was quite addressing it in the conversation that you two were having. Regardless, there was an acknowledgement, both of you seem to acknowledge, that redistribution of wealth in some form is necessary to take place. In the book, she actually pushes back harder on it, I've noticed, in that degrowth section. She pushes back a little bit harder. But in this interview, she did agree with you that it's something that's necessary. Now, I'm sorry I'm rambling. It's one more point that I want to say. There are so many economic variables and also so many environmental impacts that it's really hard to say what aspect of degrowth are we talking about? What exactly are we talking about? Because if we're just talking about just GDP itself is not a measurement of, an accurate measurement necessarily of human quality of life, for example. There's many countries, many wealthy industrialized nations that don't necessarily have exact lineups of their GDP increases with their quality of life. The United States is an example of this. Its GDP continues to grow, yet the average life expectancy in the U.S. has fallen for a couple of years in a row now, a few years in a row. Here in Australia, where I live, the average lifespan is 6 years longer, and our economy is nowhere near the size of the United States economy. Economic growth, she says, it's necessary to improve the quality of life. And I don't want to get into a debate about whether that's completely necessary, but it seems like there are definitely ways to improve quality of life without increasing GDP.
So I think it's important to note that degrowth is not focused on GDP. Degrowth is focused on essentially like how can we effectively and justly, fairly improve the well-being of people and the species that we share this planet with whilst staying within the planetary boundaries. It's like the neoliberal economic status quo that is very focused on GDP. And as you said, there's actually very little correlation between GDP and the well-being of citizens within a country, because income inequality is increasing in every single country around the world within its own borders. So the wealth that is being produced is typically flooding to the top or being stolen from the bottom. It depends how you look at it. I was also very surprised during the interview about, apart from that decoupling thing that we got stuck on, and that is not true. Nations are not decoupling. It depends on the way that it depends on how you plot the graphs. And it depends on the variables that you're pulling in. And degrowth economists and scientists have shown that it's not happening when you actually plot the graphs effectively. There's different mathematical things that you can do to a graph that I don't know enough about to really speak on at in length here. But in the book, she is very much against the redistribution of wealth, essentially. Like, she does not mention the wealthy. She does not mention the massive carbon inequality of how the wealthy use their money and the far bigger impact that they have on the planet. And she is totally against degrowth, despite degrowth also being a proponent of the redistribution of the planetary boundaries, essentially, like the right to use certain planetary boundaries in order to raise the well-being of citizens in low and middle income countries. And yet, as you say, in the interview, that was something she mentioned. And so I think what was very disappointing for me in that moment was a recognition she doesn't actually know very much about degrowth. But she's written this book that is going to be mainstream because of who is endorsing it and who is behind her, i.e. Bill Gates, the 3 degrees isn't that bad climate champion. And now people are going to get a mistaken and incorrect overview of degrowth. There's a lot of damage done in 2 pages over something that you actually haven't researched.
This was definitely a sticking point for me, but there is some good stuff I want to get to. But the next thing I wanted to point out was that you both were talking about setting the price of things, how governments choose to prioritize certain things in an economy. And Hannah said that governments or countries don't, quote unquote, magically set the price of things. And I found that an interesting thing to say because I think that's what OPEC does. They directly influence the price of oil. Yeah. It's granted, it's not a single country, it's a group of countries, right? It's a group of member states, but they basically directly have influence on the price of oil at their whim. It's entirely their decision. And they control 79.5% of the world's oil reserves. So that's almost, it's almost 80% of the world's oil. It's a critical energy commodity. The price is set by a select group of countries. So I didn't quite, that when she said that didn't quite sit well with me.
It's wrong. I think essentially what she said fulfills again this neoliberal economic vision of there is a separation of markets and governments. And so they function as two separate entities that work together in order to provide what citizens need. That's not true. We know very well that governments influence, if not set, the prices of a lot of things, even by way of subsidizing. So you mentioned oil. Oil is another thing that is subsidized to the trillions. It's subsidized to the back teeth in our economy. That's the only thing that makes it profitable, and it's subsidized by governments. And so, yeah, it's just something, again, that it reveals a certain ideology, the ideology with which she's approaching this data rather than the reality. And of course, that reality is now shifting. The thing with Bidenomics is that this whole illusion of the global free market has been totally shattered because he is directly using policy to influence economics at home and abroad more openly.
Okay, and the other thing I wanted to shift to talk about was the chapter on deforestation, because actually, I thought she said a lot of great things in this chapter. My issue was that I didn't think that she followed it up with an actual tactile how-to that could demonstrably work. I did not see that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So she pointed out how damaging beef production is. I was impressed with the amount of detail and the amount of care she took to talking about how the land use around beef is really, really heavily environmentally impactful. The solutions to these things, I felt, some of them I can't really speak to, such as increasing crop yields. Sounds like a great thing, obviously. But the one thing that she did talk about, one of the solutions that she mentioned was pay countries to keep their forests standing. And a resounding yes, I couldn't agree more. But beyond that, there was no how that I, as an environmental journalist who looks into deforestation, saw is going to work unless you're willing to give policy prescriptions, unless you're willing to get political. And in the Congo Basin context, for example, there has been so many pledges. I've talked about this with you already. And for listeners, if you haven't listened to that episode in the Congo Basin Explore series, please go listen to it. It's episode 5. And I interviewed someone from C4ECRAF. I interviewed someone from the UNDP to talk about forest financing. And there's been so much money that has been dumped into the Congo Basin, and also not nearly enough money. But what has been dumped in there's a lot of broken promises behind of it. A lot of it hasn't been distributed. Some of the money is tied up in bureaucratic tangles. And then some of it just never materialized. One of the most egregious examples I can think of is the results-based payments for Gabon, which I interviewed Lee White, the Minister of Environment there, shortly before the country experienced a coup, and he was very plainly upfront with me that he had his results certified by the UNFCCC and got no results-based payments. And those were some of the things that Hannah was saying that countries should try. And we are trying those things. Those things are being tried, but they are not working. And does that mean we should stop trying them? I'm not saying that. But what people have been clearly telling me is that there's something more that's necessary here that isn't being done. And part of it is obviously just more money. But the other thing is there needs to be shifts. There needs to be better ways to get this money to the people that need it the most.
In some ways, the solution is more money, but not more money within this framework. It has to be more money within also a value shift about what represents money. Because what we see right now is the minute that you commodify a thing, whether that's commodifying carbon or commodifying a solution or whatever, and you have that within a system that is about profit maximization, then corruption happens, essentially. And people begin to use forests, which were seen as creatures that are spirits and members of the community, then become timber commodities and then become carbon capture commodities. And until we begin to really understand the world that we participate in with a very different value, and the people in charge begin to do the same and start to see these things as so much beyond what you can put a price on, then I don't think it will matter how much money that we throw at these problems, because there will always be somebody that's going to try putting it in their back pocket. And the best way to put it in a back pocket is to charge twice for the same piece of forest, or put it on the carbon capture market and also sell it to the timber market. So there's a huge restructure of the economy that needs to happen.
And to clarify, I wasn't advocating that we use the same framework we're using now, but perhaps a different framework. I don't know what it is exactly, because I am not a politician or a forest expert. Could be that. But again, I'm not as learned on that as you are. But I am saying that if money is going to be put in, much more money would be needed. Much more would be necessary, and experts have told me as such. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that and by the way, she did say something else in this chapter I thought was really great, is she criticized biofuels, which are often touted as a sustainable fuel. And she used incredibly strong language that I was very appreciative of. She called it insulting and stupid, which I think are good terms to describe those biofuels. So, I do appreciate that she took this care in this chapter, but I still don't understand how you could get the implementation of this unless you're willing to be policy prescriptive. I think there were 5 IPCC members that argued that they should have the right to make suggestive policy statements. And we're not even talking about having the power to implement these. We're just saying having the power to say it, to be like, this is what you should do. And I'm not a scientist. I am not a politician. So it's just my opinion, but I think that's a pretty strong argument that they could do that. So the other thing here is that Hannah says that renewable energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. And that's good news, obviously. And she says that specifically, I believe she was referring to African nations, or at least low and middle income countries, but she said they'll simply adopt these technologies because they're cheaper. And I don't think we can make that assumption. I don't think we can make that assumption, because when you have a country like the DRC, for example, which has opened up blocks of its land, of its primary forest for oil exploration, they want to make money off that. I'm not saying they should. I'm not saying they should do that. I'm saying they want to. They've said they want to. And they've said it would be to lift their people out of poverty. However, the massive cobalt mining revenues still haven't lifted their people out of poverty. Exactly. It's a question of whether it will, but they want to. And just because wind and solar are there, that doesn't mean it's going to replace that fossil fuel extraction. I think it's an assumption to say that this will just take care of itself and countries will skip the deforestation curve. I hope that they do. I hope that they skip the deforestation curve. Lee White was mentioning that's what Gabon was trying to do. But I don't think we can bank on it unless there was some sort of policy compelling them to. And I'm not saying that there should be. I don't know if we can make the assumption that they're going to not tap fossil fuels.
This was the main question that people wanted me to ask Hannah. So I put out a call on my Twitter and my LinkedIn the day before, and people came in with questions. And I got this one repeatedly. I get her to explain this assumption that renewable energy is just going to be deployed instead of fossil fuels energy. And she said in the interview that she wrote an apolitical book. And you cannot write anything that is apolitical. Everything is political, right? It was some very famous feminist researcher, I can't remember, who said everything is politics. I mean, everything is politics, and especially in the hyper-globalized, hyper-connected world. And so just by claiming it's apolitical, you've essentially allowed yourself to write a book that is fairly detached from reality, in the same way that the economy is fairly detached from reality. As you say, it's a hell of an assumption. We have no evidence for it either. Instead, what we have evidence for is countries like Saudi Arabia having plans to get the continent of Africa, hooked on petrol because they're aware that their bigger, more developed clients are moving away from fossil fuels as an energy source. So it was yet another sort of kind of magic fairy dust moment in the interview and in the book. And it doesn't stand up. And I find it confusing as somebody who presents themselves as like an objective person who reads objective data. Again, it was revealed there were a huge amount of assumptions, both in how she sees the world that is impacting the data and the variables that she then chooses to analyze, and also in the messaging that she is suggesting. So yeah, very dangerous. No evidence for it.
Yeah, listen, I mean no disrespect here at all to Hannah. I do think that acknowledging political challenges and political roadblocks is objective. I think you can do that without wading into a political culture war. And sometimes I fear that people, they bristle at the idea of talking about any kind of policy for fear of wading into the cultural war. But again, it's not my book, and I understand what she's saying. I understand what she's attempting to do there. I just think that to write something that truly addresses the challenges that we face, you also have to acknowledge the political barriers. And there's a lot of political barriers here that I do think are not addressed in the book.
Hugely. I mean, this is a book for people. It's a book for people, not for governments. It's a book for the individual. And it puts the, I think, onus on the individual to change certain things about their lifestyle, like changing their diet. And some of that information was really good. It's not new information, but the way that she laid it out was very interesting and compelling. But this isn't meant to be a policy prescriptive thing that's going to change the world. To me, it read as this is something that's going to just maintain the status quo while we tinker at the edges of certain bits of it, essentially. And I want to say at this point as well, I liked Hannah. I enjoyed speaking to her, and I felt a huge amount of respect for her as well with regards to the fact that she stayed very calm when under pressure. This book is to make people feel that there are things that you can do in your own life to make the world a bit of a better place. And that's a noble sentiment. But that noble sentiment needs to be broadcasted far more loudly than couching it as a book that is about objectively revealing the data of the state of the world and could be used as a roadmap for the future. When, as you say, there are suggestions, some of them are good, but there is no roadmap about how to do it because there is no acknowledgement of the political, economic, and power dynamics that we exist in.
Well said. And yeah, I would just like to personally thank Hannah for speaking with us. Appreciate you coming onto the show.
Yeah, likewise.
I'll see you on the next one, Rachel.
See you there.
If you're interested in reading Hannah Ritchie's book for yourself, you can learn more about it via the link in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content, like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is indeed the best way to help us expand our reach, but you can always support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet. Even just $1 per month makes a big difference and helps us offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, go to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast and all of our podcast content. And you can also join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast well over 500,000 times now by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or follow us on social media. Find Mongabay on our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.